Thanks very much, John, and thank you for inviting me to your society. John is an old friend and he's very encouraging. And before we came here, he told me that he was absolutely sure that my talk would be such that you would have no regrets that it's the last one of the season. The title of my talk is a little bit provocative. It actually came from a provocative tweet that I noticed recently. Somebody was saying that charity begins at home, and then someone else says, yes, but if it begins at home, where does it end? I wasn't in a very serious mood at that time, so I chimed in and I said, well, if it begins at home, it'll probably end there too. But actually you can make a serious question out of it. Where does it end, in the sense of where is it going? And what are its ends? So talking to a natural history and philosophy society, I didn't think that people here would be very interested in an approach which heightened using charity as virtue, a form of virtue signalling, telling you what a good thing it is and that sort of style. I thought that instead you might be more interested in an anthropological approach to it, to have a look at its origins and to trace its effects through some of the more important turning points in history. I say the word history and quickly remind myself that we haven't got till the end of history for this talk to finish, so I think I've been asked to talk for about 50 minutes. Is that right? Yes, so that's what it's going to be, and I will stop in mid-sentence if I have to achieve that. So I think that my approach is going to be that since we humans are part of nature and we need to form a relationship with nature in order to survive, we're forced to, then in engaging with nature, we're also forced to organize ourselves in various patterns. So the relations we form within the human community are driven by, or at least constrained by, the nature of the relationship that we're able to have with nature. And so here is not a moral but material basis for studying charity, the same material basis as exists for studying natural philosophy and indeed natural history and indeed any philosophy. I thought that despite the frivolous nature of this epithet that I picked up, that, if charity begins at home, where does it end? Despite that frivolity, it might offer a fruitful development. This often happens, that things that look very unpromising turn out to be promising if you look at them closely enough. And I looked at this and then found out that the proverb "charity begins at home" has very ancient origins. It was first recorded in English in the late 14th century in a treatise by Bishop John Wycliffe, whom some of you may know was a precursor to the Reformation, which took place 150 years after his existence. But Wycliffe was a dissident Catholic priest, at Oxford University, and his unorthodox doctrines gained a following in a movement that became known as the Lollards, and they were an anticipation of the Reformation that later took place, led by Martin Luther in the 16th century. And what Wycliffe said in a treatise he wrote about priests, it's called Of Prelates, he said that charity should begin at himself. And what the context in which he was saying this was his complaint in his thesis, his complaint that much tribute was being sent out of England to Rome, and in his view, in Rome there were plenty of very well looked after, prosperous church staff and retainers. The Church of Rome in Rome was very wealthy, but the congregants of the English congregations were quite poor. And you can see in that the sort of development of the critique of too luxurious a church that then became the theme of Luther and the Reformation after that. So there was some policy underlying Wycliffe's comment, the policy that fed into the development of the Reformation movement, which eventually probably did not reform, but instead divided the Catholic Church. So, looking now at this saying that charity begins at home, I'm going to say that the parent of this saying is John Wycliffe. And I'm going to say that this saying cannot claim any authority whatsoever from Wycliffe, because Wycliffe's advice was focused. It was intended to address a specific problem inside the institution of the church as he saw it. It wasn't a generalization on the principle of charity. Wycliffe was not trying to say that in all circumstances you should direct your bounty at those closest to you. Not saying that at all. And so I'm going to set aside this idea that charity begins at home as having no authoritative basis, but merely being a perversion of a very ancient text that probably has not been read and certainly not understood for what it was. Indeed, Wycliffe would have been well aware that the general principle of Christianity on the scope of charity is derived from the book of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy, the Old Testament of the Jews. Now, as I get this far, some of you might be recalling my promise that the philosophical basis of this talk is entirely material and secular. Now I'm mentioning books of the Bible, and you might be a little bit worried that I've embarked on the new English tradition of no sooner having made a promise that you break it. But I promise you this isn't the case. I take the liberty of mentioning Leviticus and Deuteronomy in a scientific society with whose aims I am foursquare in sympathy, because Leviticus was written 4 to 7 centuries before Christ, and Deuteronomy, according to the latest scholarship, is at least 9,000 years old. And 9,000 years old means that the scribes were writing that tract maybe only 1,000 years after the discovery of agriculture by people living in West Asia. And so I think I'm entitled to ask you a question. Is it worth looking at what scribes living just after the discovery of agriculture were writing about how you need to organize society? Is it worth doing that? Would we like to engage with those people's writings 9,000 years ago? There may be many disadvantages to the Bible, but one of the advantages is that it does give you some authentic text that is very old indeed. And our modern researches into that text give us some much more reliable dating than we would have had from the religious themselves. The Jewish rabbis, with their thought that the earth is 5,800 years old, would be lost here at this point, because they'd be wondering how it was that Deuteronomy was written for 3,000 years before the earth was created. This would be very perplexing for them. But if we approach the scriptures through the lens of modern scholarship and modern science, we don't get nothing, we get something. The something may not be belief in God, but the something is we get communication from people who were living 9,000 years ago, and we get their thoughts on how to organize society in light of the issues that they felt that they faced. So that's the line I'm going to go along for a little bit, and I will try to get us up to modern times. In the time that I have, it's not going to be detailed all the way, but I will try to touch on some important turning points, the turning points that show the most important themes, so that you leave here having had some stimulation, I hope, and a platform from which to launch further thoughts of your own. So the book of Leviticus, written between 4 and 7 centuries before Christ, it contains the general charitable command, and they are commands. The entreaties in the 5 books of Moses are all commands. They're not advice. They are laws, and Judaism considers those commands to be laws to this day. And so you have the command, I know you're going to be very familiar with it, love your neighbor as yourself. I want to examine this concept a little more. This concept, as I say, it occurs between 4 and 7 centuries before Christ lived. As I'm sure you're all aware, Christ himself put forward this thesis as well repeatedly. It's reported in the New Testament scriptures that he did. But before Jesus lived, the precept was amplified and considered by the Jewish scholar Hillel the Elder, who was an older contemporary of Jesus. Hillel died when Jesus was 15 or 16 years old. So Jesus would have been aware of the teachings of Hillel. Hillel was cutting edge philosophy for the people of his time in the Tiberias area of Israel. And Hillel explained love your neighbor as yourself as follows. He'd been asked to summarize the whole teachings of God while standing on one foot. This was a disrespectful student had asked this of him. No one's ever asked me to explain anything while standing on one foot. Obviously, they're more afraid of me than they were of Hillel the Elder. But actually, Hillel the Elder made a fair fist of it. He did stand on one foot. And he told the student, look, whatever is hateful to you, don't do that to anyone else. That's the whole teaching of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. All the rest is commentary. Go and learn it. So this is quite an interesting thing. If you break it down, first of all, notice that it's entirely secular. Hillel is not saying, do what God wants you to do. You don't even have to believe in God to follow this command. He's saying that you are equipped with empathy. You have the intellectual and emotional equipment which allows you to understand what another human being would feel in certain circumstances. You know how you would feel if you were treated in a certain way. Therefore, you know how the other person would feel. And so use your empathy and loving your neighbour as yourself, you see, that is a completely secular notion, and it's guided by the insight of the scribe who wrote it, and certainly the insight of Hillel, that we have empathy. We have evolved the quality of empathy as human beings, and we can connect that up with modern anthropology, and we can see that clearly the sentiments that we have, particularly the ones that are useful, are ones that we derive through evolution. If a community survives better by understanding one another and solidifying, then natural selection selects for those intellectual qualities. If, on the other hand, people are divided and engaging in rivalry all the time, the community in that form has less chance of surviving. So I think I'm going to suggest that the scribe of Leviticus and Hillel had understood this important quality of empathy. So that was the cutting edge of Jewish thought at the very time when Jesus was growing up in Nazareth. And of course, because he was also Jewish, I mean, Jesus was Jewish. So when I say this, it causes massive surprise to some people. They say, no, Jesus was Christian. Of course, yeah, if you think about it, it wasn't possible for Jesus to be a Christian, because Christians believe in things that happened after Jesus died. And so when Jesus was alive, he would practice the religion he was born into. And if you read the scriptures, you'll see that he lived the life of an Orthodox Jewish man. The food he ate, the prayers he said, the claims he made about the nature of God, these are all entirely consistent with Judaism. So Jesus, an Orthodox Jewish preacher, naturally passed on the golden rule, do unto others as you would be done by. The golden rule, love your neighbour as yourself. Naturally, he passed that on, as reported in the Christian New Testament, in Matthew and in the other Gospels. And because the golden rule is entirely secular and it doesn't depend on choosing a particular God, this meant that the Golden Rule would equally influence Jews and Christians and Muslims and other religious and non-religious ethical systems. So I think that is quite an interesting, I hope it's an interesting exposition on the power of an idea and the origins of that idea, and that idea is rooted in the concept of charity. But in addition to these general entreaties to help others that you find in these very ancient books, there are also some very particular laws that have their own interest. Again, in Leviticus, we find a rule that some of us call the law of the corner of the field. And this is what it says. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. So this is of particular interest, because I think you can see that it's not a general entreaty to give away some spare money when you feel like it. It's setting a workplace rule. It's setting that rule in the workplace because it's in the workplace that value is created. And as soon as that value is created, the surplus of that value, or what is left through a fairly cursory harvest, that surplus is immediately assigned for the benefit of the poor and the alien. In modern charitable organisation, we used to encourage companies to organise something called payroll giving. That is to get the whole workforce to agree to a few pence being deducted from their pay slips automatically every month. And if you can get a very large company with 300,000 employees to agree to payroll giving of £1 a month, you can see you can raise a massive amount of charity. It's payroll giving. Well, the people who thought up payroll giving would have been disappointed to hear that someone else thought of it 5,000 years before it occurred to them. Because here it is, it's linking the act of production with the act not just of appropriating the value that you have created, but also with the act of redistributing some of that value immediately as it is created. And that's consistent with Deuteronomy, which is even older, late 7th century BC, so 9,000 years old. Very similar concept. When you beat the olives from your trees, you must not go over the branches again. What remains will be for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. So, at 2 points in very ancient texts, you have this idea that when you are producing, in the act of producing, you should also immediately be distributing some of that, not just to yourself because you own the field and the crops, but to others who do not have those ownership rights, should immediately be allocating to them. So, what might be the social or economic or historical context of the ancient Hebrews adopting, or at least being entreated to adopt? Why would they adopt these practices? I mean, God knows in their time earning a living was a lot harder than it is in our time, at least here in Northern Ireland. And so why this? So I think it's helpful to apply some anthropology to this account, because it looks like these charitable laws relate to a period when human society was in transition between being a society of nomadic herding of animals, transition from that to being a settled arable agriculture. You're probably familiar with the idea that human development, social development, economic development has passed through certain stages. Certainly in natural history, you label certain periods actually according to the material that the tools were made of, don't you? These very early ages are named after the tools that are found for those ages. So you link human development with the mode of production that those people were following. And in fact, the well-known father of English economics, Adam Smith, he made this point too in some lectures that he gave on property law, actually, a few years before he published his Wealth of Nations economics book. He pointed out to his students in Glasgow University that this is what he said. He said, the regulations, referring to the laws, the regulations must vary considerably according to the status or age society is in at that time. Then he goes on to outline what are these stages. You'll find them a little old-fashioned, but they're correct for his time, and we updated them. But he says there are 4 distinct stages which mankind pass through. First, the age of hunters. I think we would call that hunter-gatherers now. Then the age of shepherds. Thirdly, the age of agriculture. And fourthly, the age of commerce, and which he considered to be his age, the 18th century in which he was giving those lectures. I think we would now say that the 18th century indeed was an age of commerce. It was the earliest stage of capitalism, the age of merchant capitalism, which later its accumulations were available to be used to invest to create industrial capitalism through the 19th century. And then today, some of us would say that we've passed through the age of manufacturing capital. The influence of manufacturing capital is in decline in the Northern Hemisphere. And instead we're seeing an age where finance capital is more dominant, as I think Brexit persuaded me has been the case. I was very disappointed to see how the manufacturers were absolutely shafted by Brexit, both here in Northern Ireland and certainly in Britain. Before I studied law, in the middle of my life, I was an engineer working for Smith's Industries in Cricklewood, and the components, even at that time, thousands of components arrived from all over the world at the factory. The modern factory is not a dirty building in one place. The modern factory is a whole continent. You take a company like Jaguar Land Rover, they import. How many components do you think they import? or did import from Europe until those geniuses of Brexit had their success? Any guesses? How many components? 7,000. Several. What's that, a year?
Oh, sorry.
A month? A week?
What do you want, a percentage?
A day?
7,000
7,000 components a day?
75% of the components.
Yeah.
I don't know what percentage it is. But if I told you it was 25 million components, and I'm not saying per year, and I'm not saying per month, or per week, per day, 25 million components per day, shipped frictionlessly from all over Europe to their factory. Imagine what they think about what happened next. Just quite awful for the company. A small digression, I can't quite work out how we got there. I think it's been on my mind ever since. But yes, I know exactly how we got there. It's because I thought that Brexit would never succeed because all the manufacturers would get together, they put their foot down, and no Conservative government would dare oppose the wishes of the manufacturing capitalists. But afterwards, how wrong I was. And I then had to think differently, and the conclusion I reached was that notwithstanding the influence of big manufacturing companies, who had more influence were people who had a more Smith-like attitude to finance. They were there to launder finance, to speculate with it, and what they wanted was a giant tax haven. And Europe was threatening to bring in tougher banking controls. And we got Brexit against the wishes of manufacturers, but I think promoting the influence of a more powerful finance capitalism as opposed to manufacturing capitalism. Of course, my sympathies lie with where I saw capitalism at work at its best, which was when we were making motor car components and medical plastics and all sorts of other fantastically useful things. And so I was disappointed. But Smith's idea that the human species pass through stages which relate to the type of way that we make our daily bread, our mode of production, the age of hunters, to modernize it, hunter-gatherers, agriculturalists, manufacturers, traders, manufacturers, financiers, these stages, you have to classify history in some way. If you don't classify anything, you don't know what, you don't even have a shape that you can study to analyze further. Even if you start by misclassifying, it's better to do that than to just try to review something that is shapeless. So Smith classified stages of history that way. Subsequently, modern anthropology has classified stages of human economic development in quite a similar fashion. So if we do that, we can look at Deuteronomy and Leviticus again, and we can say, well, what stage are the Hebrews at when they find it important to leave some of the harvest in the field for widows and aliens and orphans? What stage are they at? And we are told, because we have this story, big story of the Hebrews being in the wilderness. I take it that these people are nomadic herdsmen. They have to eat something. I'm not going to take on board the idea that manna fell from heaven and they ate that. I'm going to assume that they had quite a few goats with them, and that's what they ate while they were wandering around in the desert. And then you have the entry into the promised land, Canaan. So you have in the 5 books of Moses this pivotal point, the transition from being nomadic herdsmen, the transition from that to settled agriculture. Obviously, it didn't happen instantly, it happened over time. I think that probably the indigenous people of North America were going through that stage in their evolution when Europeans landed to colonize North America. And then you see the hopelessly incompatible relationship then between the Europeans, who are settled agriculturalists with gunpowder, and the Native Americans, who are nomadic herdsmen who follow the herds of buffalo round their terrain. And they think that their whole continent is theirs and safe just because it's there. Whereas the Europeans think that land is only safe when you have put it behind a stockade and defended it with gunpowder. And then you have the tragic inability of those two completely different civilizations to find a compatible meeting point. But the Hebrew scribes are describing people like the Native Americans, but Hebrews living in West Asia 9,000 years ago. And so what's going on here? What's going on? I'm going to suggest that what's going on is that the Hebrews are realizing that on the one hand, settled agricultural life is bringing them huge economic benefits, because instead of having to search for their food, hunt it or gather it, they control the production of their own food in their own land. They've reached a stage where they've noticed that certain seeds will grow plants that produce the same seeds again. They've noticed this at some time when they've been settled for a few weeks, and they can notice that a plant growing out of the ground is has the same seeds as the seeds that they saw lying on the ground 6 weeks previously. So you need that observation to take place. That's why it took such a long time to discover agriculture. You need that sort of observation. You can make that observation most easily if you live by a river. Living by a river as a hunter-gatherer will keep you static for a while, because when you're by a river, your food swims towards you. You don't have to run after it. And so in these territories where you have big estuaries of rivers, like in West Asia, in Israel, Palestine, that region, Egypt with the Nile and so on, you get the first settled agriculture, at least on this side of the globe. So they're noticing the huge benefits of settled agriculture. They're also getting the first benefit of what Adam Smith called the division of labor. That is that when you grow your own crops, you don't need everyone to be involved in growing them. When you're hunting, you need everyone to be hunting, because hunting is really inefficient. No sooner have you hunted something and eaten it that you're hungry again, and you all have to go piling off to find something else to hunt and kill and eat. When you're growing crops, you create a surplus of crops, and that surplus can be used to feed people who do not have to be in the field. So the people who don't have to be in the field, maybe they can get some sticks and they can sharpen the sticks. And then the people in the field can use the sticks to help to till the ground. So that makes them more efficient as agriculturalists. So the efficiency comes from the division of labour, because you're now creating expert pointed stick makers who are working alongside the expert agriculturalists. And the stick makers soon get bored with their sticks because they realize that with a little more effort you could make sharper sticks with flint tied to it. You could make spades, you could make more efficient implements, and you do. And so agriculture gets better and fewer people have to be in the field. So some people can make vessels to store food in, and if you store food instead of letting the vermin eat it, then you've got more food effectively. So you need fewer people in the field, so more can be released from the field and they can build shelters. And if you can keep warm in your shelters, then you don't need to eat as many calories, so you don't need as many people in the field, and so on and so forth. And so the Hebrews are realizing the benefits of settled agricultural existence and the division of labor, the beginnings of specialized work. But with specialized work comes the need to exchange the goods that the specialists have created. And so you get the beginnings of trading. The people who make one thing need to trade those things with people who make another thing, so that both parties can have both things. So you get the beginnings of ownership, because you have to own something in order to trade it. You have to own the thing that you trade it for in order to benefit from the transaction. So you get the beginnings of private property coming out of the impetus of the division of labour made possible by settled agriculture. And what do the Hebrews say about that? Well, I think what they realize is that there's a huge benefit in their new settled mode of existence with the division of labour, but also they have released forces that threaten the cohesion of society, because while everyone is equally poor, everyone is equally cohesive. But if you have a situation of trading relationships and private property, then inequalities in wealth can then lead to inequalities in power, and those inequalities in power lead to a loss of social cohesion. And so I think that these charitable laws that I've mentioned to you are not only motivated by the need to maintain everyone in existence. Of course, they're motivated by that too, because not everyone is likely to be able to do something useful in this system. But also they're motivated by an attempt to hold back the development of inequality. And I think I have found some evidence for that proposition. And the evidence is in another bit of charity law that can be found in the Old Testament, and that is the idea of the Jubilee year. This is a law that says that in every 50th year, any property that has been sold has to be returned to the original owner or their successors every 50th year. And so that's quite interesting. It means that while you think that you're engaging in a freehold sale, in the background is the clocking down of the 50 Jubilee years. And this actually converts, even the most determined sale of a freehold is converted into nothing more than a 50-year leasehold. But what the Jubilee year achieves then is that, in general terms, market conditions are allowed to develop, but they're held back every 50 years with the return of the properties to the original owners. And so this means that this is the way in which the Hebrews are mitigating against the disadvantages of the advance of private property. They're trying to balance the advantages and the disadvantages in this way. So in other words, the idea that the distribution of wealth is an extremely important issue, this idea is not modern at all. It's at least 9,000 years old. And the people who considered it did not do so just in the abstract, but they tried to devise rules and laws that would help them to achieve a policy of balanced economic development while also retaining social cohesion. This also prevents the accumulation of very large estates in few hands, and was extremely prescient, I would argue, because later that's exactly what occurred. The accumulation of huge estates in few hands, creating the horrors of slavery in the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, which the Jubilee year would have blocked completely had it been in force in those societies. And I think my interpretation is supported by the additional rule that during the Jubilee year, any slaves or indentured labourers were to be freed and all debts were to be cancelled. And when I compare that insightfulness, in other words, you know, the thought, if you don't want to give charity, then don't create poverty. Yes, why not preempt charity by not creating poverty? Is something that someone said. I can't remember who it was. Someone clever anyway. If you don't want that, or if you don't do something to prevent that, you lead to where we are today. Where are we today in this respect worldwide? Well, about 10 years ago, Oxfam issued a horrific report which told us that the about 60 richest people on earth owned as much wealth, that is, their capital assets, were equal to all the capital assets owned by the poorest half of humanity. So 60 people who can get on a London double-decker bus, 60 people owned the same as 3.5 billion people. That was, I think, about 10 years ago. And then 2 years ago, Oxfam reviewed the report and brought the figures up to date. You'll be glad to know now we don't need to hire an expensive London bus, because an 8-seater VW Caravelle will do the trick and ship around the 8 richest people in the world whose assets are equal to 3.5 billion people's assets. So I think, I hope that what I'm saying here is food for thought when you compare the foresightfulness of 9,000-year-old agricultural human beings with the brilliant wisdom of well-educated Westerners today. I think the contrast is quite horrifying. I think I've run out of time, haven't I?